Walk into a traditional Japanese home and something feels different before you even notice why. The shoes are lined up perfectly by the door. The kitchen counter is empty except for what's actually being used. Somewhere, a small, unhurried ritual is happening. Folding a cloth, wiping a surface, arranging a single flower, and no one seems to be rushing through it. Nothing about this looks like discipline in the way we usually picture it. There's no gym, no strict schedule pinned to a wall, no motivational quote framed above a desk. And yet, people raised inside homes like this often carry a quiet, almost invisible self-control that shows up everywhere else in their lives. In their work, their relationships, their finances, their health. So here's the question worth asking. What if discipline was never supposed to be loud? What if the most powerful self-control habits are the small, repetitive, almost boring actions we do at home every single day, the ones we've been taught to overlook? Today, we're looking at 7 quiet Japanese home habits. Not exotic secrets, but ordinary daily actions. And exploring exactly why they build discipline more effectively than almost anything you'll find in a self-improvement book. Before we get into the habits themselves, it's worth understanding something important about discipline in general. Most people think of discipline as a personality trait, something you either have or you don't. But psychologists who study self-control tell a very different story. Discipline behaves less like a fixed trait and more like a muscle, or more precisely, like a skill. And skills are built through repetition, not through willpower alone. This is the hidden logic behind Japanese home culture. Very few of the habits we're about to explore were designed consciously as discipline training. They emerged from practicality, tradition, and respect for shared spaces. But their effect, whether intended or not, is a kind of quiet daily practice in self-regulation. Let's walk through them one by one. Habit 1. Removing your shoes at the door. This is often the first thing visitors to Japan notice, and it's usually dismissed as simply a hygiene custom, keeping the outside world, literally, outside. And that's true, but there's a second, less obvious layer to this habit. Removing your shoes requires a pause, a small physical interruption between the outside world and the inside one. You cannot rush this transition. You have to stop, bend down, remove each shoe, and place it neatly. Often turn to face the door for easy departure later. This tiny ritual creates what psychologists call a transition cue, a deliberate signal to the brain that one context has ended and another has begun. Research on habit formation shows that clear transition cues help the brain shift more effectively between mental states, reducing the emotional residue of a stressful commute or a difficult day from bleeding into the home environment. In other words, this isn't just about clean floors. It's a daily, physical practice in leaving one version of yourself at the door and consciously stepping into another. Habit 2, the art of genkan order. Connected to the shoe removal habit is something called the genkan, the small entryway space just inside a Japanese home, slightly lower than the rest of the floor, where shoes are removed and arranged. In most homes, shoes in the genkan are lined up neatly, pointed toward the door. This might seem like an unnecessary extra step. Why not just leave the shoes wherever they land? But this small act of ordering, every single day, for every family member, without exception, is a repeated exercise in returning your environment to a baseline of order, immediately, rather than letting disorder accumulate. Here's what's interesting from a behavioral science perspective. Environments with visible small-scale order have been shown, in multiple studies on environmental psychology, to reduce stress and support better decision-making. But more relevant to our topic today, the daily physical act of creating that order, bending down, adjusting the shoes, making the space right, is a repeated rehearsal of a specific discipline skill. Closing loops, finishing a task completely rather than leaving it good enough. Habit 3, folding, not draping. In many Japanese households, clothing isn't casually tossed over chairs or left in piles. Items are folded, often quite precisely, even for temporary storage, even for clothes that will be worn again the next day. This extends to towels, blankets, and futons, which in traditional homes are folded and stored away each morning rather than left out. On the surface, this looks like simple tidiness, but folding, done consistently, is actually a small act of care directed toward objects that don't require it. A t-shirt doesn't need to be folded precisely to function as a t-shirt tomorrow. The choice to fold it anyway is a choice to apply intentional effort in a moment where cutting corners would cost nothing. And no one would notice. This is precisely the kind of low-stakes decision that, repeated daily, trains what researchers call self-control across domains. Multiple psychological studies have found that self-control isn't neatly compartmentalized. Improving it in one small, seemingly unrelated area, like how you fold a towel, tends to correlate with improvements in unrelated areas, like financial discipline or emotional regulation. The mechanism isn't magic, it's practice. You're rehearsing the decision to do the slightly harder, more intentional thing, even when no one is watching and nothing is at stake. Habit 4. The nightly reset. Many Japanese households maintain a nightly ritual of resetting the home to a baseline state before sleep. Dishes washed, surfaces wiped, items returned to their place. The next day's needs briefly prepared. This isn't treated as a special cleaning session. It's treated as simply the ordinary, expected end of the day. This habit connects to something psychologists call environmental closure, the practice of ending a day with your environment matching a clear, calm baseline, rather than carrying the visual clutter and unfinished tasks of today directly into tomorrow. Sleep researchers have found that visual clutter, particularly in the bedroom and kitchen, is associated with increased cortisol levels and reduced sleep quality. But beyond the physical benefit, there's a psychological one too. Resetting your space each night is a daily rehearsal of a skill many people struggle with as adults: finishing what you started. Not perfectly, not extravagantly, just completely before moving on. This is one of the quiet foundations of discipline, the ability to close a day's loop instead of letting it drag, unfinished, into the next one. Habit 5. Eating with intention. In traditional Japanese meals, there's a phrase spoken before eating, itadakimasu, roughly meaning "I humbly receive." It's said quietly, often with a small pause before the first bite. This isn't primarily a religious gesture in most modern households. It's closer to a moment of acknowledgement, a brief pause of attention before consumption begins. This tiny pause matters more than it might seem. Research on mindful eating has consistently shown that a brief moment of attention before a meal, even something as simple as noticing what's in front of you, reduces the likelihood of mindless overeating and increases satisfaction from smaller portions. But there's a discipline dimension here too, beyond nutrition. This pause is a daily practice in resisting immediate impulse. Even for something as basic and necessary as eating, there's a small, repeated moment of restraint, a brief delay between desire and action. And this specific skill, the ability to insert even a few seconds of pause between wanting something and taking it, is one of the most well-documented predictors of long-term self-discipline in psychological research, dating back to the famous delayed gratification studies of the 1960s and 70s. Habit 6. Cleaning as shared responsibility, starting in childhood. In many Japanese schools, students clean their own classrooms, hallways, and even bathrooms, not as punishment, but as a normal, expected part of the school day, starting from a very young age. This custom, called osuji, extends naturally into home life, where children are frequently given consistent household responsibilities well before they'd be considered old enough for chores in many other cultures. What's notable here isn't the cleaning itself. It's the consistency and the framing. The work isn't presented as an occasional favor to parents or an earned punishment for misbehavior. It's presented as an ordinary, expected contribution to a shared space, done the same way, every day, regardless of mood. This kind of consistent, low-stakes daily responsibility, introduced early and maintained without much negotiation, builds what developmental psychologists sometimes call habitual competence. The sense that certain actions simply happen, reliably, regardless of motivation. This is arguably the single most important ingredient in adult discipline. Not motivation, not willpower in the dramatic sense. Just the quiet expectation, built over years, that certain things get done, every day, whether you feel like it or not. Habit 7. The practice of intentional empty space. Our final habit is less an action and more a principle that shapes many of the others. A Japanese aesthetic and philosophical concept referring to meaningful, intentional emptiness. The pause between notes in music, the blank space in a room, the silence in a conversation. In many Japanese homes, this shows up as a resistance to clutter, not out of minimalism as a trend, but as an active appreciation for the empty space itself. A room isn't considered incomplete because it isn't full. A shelf isn't automatically decorated simply because it has room for decoration. The empty space is treated as having its own value, a kind of visual and mental breathing room. This might seem like the habit least related to discipline, but it may actually be the most foundational one. A home that isn't crowded with objects requires less decision-making, less maintenance, and less mental clutter to navigate daily. Behavioral scientists have a term for the cumulative cost of constant small decisions: decision fatigue. Every object in a space represents a tiny, ongoing decision. Where does it go? When do I clean it? Does it still serve a purpose? A home shaped by Emma dramatically reduces this ongoing decision load, freeing up exactly the kind of mental energy that self-discipline in every other area of life actually requires. So here's what ties all 7 of these habits together. None of them are about discipline in the way we usually imagine it: dramatic, effortful, motivational. They're about repetition, about small, consistent actions performed the same way, every day, regardless of mood, regardless of how tired or busy or distracted you are. This is worth sitting with because it challenges a common, exhausting belief many of us carry: that discipline requires constant conscious effort and willpower. The Japanese home habits we've just explored suggest something gentler and honestly more sustainable. That discipline can be built quietly, almost invisibly, through the ordinary architecture of your daily environment. Not through forcing yourself to feel motivated every single day, but through designing small, repeated actions so consistent that they stop requiring motivation at all. If you're looking for a place to start, you don't need to overhaul your entire home tonight. Choose just one of these 7 habits, perhaps the nightly reset or the small pause before eating, and practice it daily, exactly the same way, for the next 30 days. Not because the habit itself will transform your life, but because the repetition will quietly begin training the exact same skill that shows up everywhere else. Discipline matters. The ability to do the small, right thing, consistently, even when no one is watching and nothing dramatic is at stake. Maybe discipline was never about the big, dramatic moments we've been taught to chase. Maybe it's been hiding quietly in the small, repeated actions of an ordinary day, waiting for us to finally pay attention. Which of these 7 habits do you think would be the hardest for you to practice consistently? And which one might you actually try this week? If this gave you a small, practical idea worth trying, helps this reach more people looking for that same quiet kind of change. And if you'd like more of these grounded, practical explorations of Japanese wisdom, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. Feel free to share this with someone who might enjoy building a little more calm discipline into their own home.